All right, welcome everyone. Excited to see such a big crew for this talk. I want to say welcome and thanks to Ted Heneke for being here, and we're looking forward to your talk, Ted. Doubt, aversion, theory.
Thank you. I will just say if I'm going to be recording this talk, so just be aware of that. If you have an issue with that, just shunt over to that side of the room and you won't be in it. I mean, obviously the back of you is the only thing. And also it's zoomed in. So, welcome to my talk on doubt aversion theory. This talk's going to be a bit fun. There's some memes in here, so anyone who likes memes. But I'll get started. So, if I can get this working. Is it working? All right. So I'm just going to start with a slide on the confidence and competence sort of thing going on. I'm actually not going to come back to this point until it'll probably come up in the question and answer. So this slide is just a little bit of context. So who has seen this before? Who's familiar with this Dunning-Kruger effect, right? I'm going to give you a couple of ironic facts about this. So the first, by the way, I mean, I take this to basically be we're really bad at assessing our own competence, right? Or at least the subjects that went into the experiment were really bad. Now, the first ironic fact is that Kruger was the primary author, and David Dunning's been trying to convince people to call it the Kruger-Dunning effect, but he's given up at this point because it's kind of taken a life of its own. The second thing is that that's actually not the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you go to the original paper, this is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And essentially you're seeing in the black line here, people are estimating themselves to be pretty roughly the same in terms of competence at different things, while their actual competence is doing this. So I feel like maybe you could probably derive the other chart from that, but it's not the original stuff. So now David Dunning's explanation of what's going on here is that the skills that we need to assess how good we are at something are exactly the same skills that we need to actually be good at it. And I think that's a pretty good explanation. But I do think there's a bit more going on here too, and that's kind of what this talk is about. James?
What's going on there?
I should explain it. So this is the competence axis, this is the confidence axis. So as your actual competence increases, initially you're very confident and you think you're really, really good at something, right? And then as your competence increases, you immediately realize, oh, I'm actually not very good at this at all. Does that make sense? Yeah. For those who haven't seen it before. All right, so now in this talk, I'm going to basically be picking up on a very old idea in education, which goes back to Plutarch. This is a very often misquoted quote, and actually we don't know that it was Plutarch who said it, but it's most likely Plutarch who said it. And that's the correct analogy for the mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting. And I heard Deb made reference to that idea last night as well at the critical thinking symposium. So setting the scene here, I'm going to talk about the internet and post-truth because that's really what got me fascinated with this topic. Epistemological context, the irrationality of consumerism, that seems a bit left of field, but you'll see where it's going. The ethics of belief and reckless thinking, wishful thinking, and how we might explain wishful thinking. And that's my theory, doubt aversion theory. And then a little summary. So, to set the scene, 30 years of the internet roughly now that we've had. And there's this quote here from this wonderful film, which I recommend you go and watch. The original promise of the Californian ideology was that the computers would liberate us from the old forms of political control and we would become Randian heroes in control of our own destiny. Well, as we know, that didn't exactly occur, right? The cypherpunks as well, they thought that with cryptography, with the power of cryptography, there was going to be no more totalitarianism, everything was going to be great. Julian Assange in 2012 was like, nah, that didn't work. And it's actually the Assange case that really got me studying this thing. You can talk to me about that after. I found this meme the other day, which I really like. People in 1999 using the internet as an escape from reality. People in 2026 using reality as an escape from the internet. There are a lot of people who are getting a bit fed up with the whole thing, right? From cyber optimism to cyber pessimism. Now, why did it go so wrong? You know, access to information, universal access to information. It was going to be great, right? That's what I've been looking at. Now, there's also this idea of post-truth politics, which I'm sure you're familiar with. That was coined by Steve Tessick, a playwright, in 1992, in this wonderful article in The Nation, A Government of Lies, and he talked about the difference between Watergate and Iran-Contra. And he noted that factual information just seemed to be losing its ability to drive political change, going from scandals like Watergate through to farces, as he termed Iran-Contra. Basically, Reagan got away with it, right? This is a very widely debated concept, but to me it does seem that there's something in this, that today's sort of socio-political issues and so forth don't really reflect a shortage of access to information, right? We've all got lots of access. Rather, I think motivation is playing a really big role here, and that a lot of us just don't want the information. Another really good film which I recommend, Hypernormalization, goes into sort of how totalitarians are gaming this kind of thing as well. Which ties, of course, nicely to Michael Lynch's talk from earlier. So I want to dig today into the psychology and philosophy of what's going on here and what might be driving this thing. All right, so some epistemological context. I'm going to present a real hot take here. I have run it past Alan Hayek, and he was happy with it, so we'll see if you will roast me for it. But I'll get into it, but first I need to provide some context about what's going on in psychology, or what has been going on in psychology. So there's this concept called theoretical amnesia. This is Danny Borsboom. I can never pronounce his name. I don't speak Dutch. But I have a lot of respect for the work he does. And he has this article way back in 2013 on the Open Science Collaboration blog called Theoretical Amnesia. He says, in a given field, the role of statistics grows as soon as the presence of scientific theory wanes. Fields of inquiry can actually develop a kind of philosophical disorder, theoretical amnesia, whereby researchers no longer know what a theory is and can now neither recognize its presence or its absence. Go and read the full thing. It's hilarious. It's a really, really funny article, actually. Aronin and Bringman in 2021, I think is a really good paper as well on this. They said the theoretical foundations of psychology are shaky. We're facing a theory crisis, as they're calling it now, right? That is more fundamental than the replication crisis. The focus should be shifting towards developing better theories. And I would just summarize this by saying there's sort of too much empiricism now. It's kind of swung the other way from early in the 20th century, and not enough what might pejoratively be called armchair philosophy. So we need a mix, right? We need both of these sort of things going on, the empirical and the rational. And that brings me into what I'm going to call for the moment evidence-based fundamentalism. And this is the hot take, right? Now, I'm sure lots of people have heard of this law of the instrument, which is when all you've got is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, even a screw. But when all you've got is empiricism, everything starts to look like evidence, right? What is evidence? If you go and read the Stanford Encyclopedia on Philosophy, there's this wonderful quote here. When we try to define evidence, we find it very difficult. Now, evidence is also, there's a very pragmatic definition you can take. It's just that which supports a proposition, right? And if anyone went to Magdalene's talk, she gave that definition too, and I think it's a good definition. I think it's fine, right? But there's a problem. We already have words for that, right? A justification, a reason. And if it's multiple structured reasons, you could call it an argument, right? So what's going on here? These things are not the same thing as evidence, right? We don't treat them the same. I think Borsboom and his colleagues can help us, right? I'm going to present this little schema that I've put together just to help my own understanding and build my own understanding of philosophy of science, right? And I really love diagrams, as anyone who knows me knows. This is enormous. I'm sorry about that. But what's great about diagrams is if there's something wrong here, you can object to it and we can make the diagram better, right? So I'm just going to very quickly go through this. At the bottom, you see data. In the middle, you see phenomena. At the top, you see theories, right? And going up on the left, you've got inductive generalization, abductive generalization. On the way down, you've got deductive prediction and inductive prediction. So at the bottom, you've got your raw data. Then you do your correlation stuff, all that, statistics and whatnot. And then you've got your causal stuff up the top. That's my understanding of sort of how philosophy of science works. If I'm wrong, please come and tell me later. Now, here's my sort of point, right? Is that evidence as an idea is a bit misleading, right? Because when you look at this, where does it really fit, right? I would say it fits here, right? It's used to represent the concept of data. It's also used to represent the concept of phenomena, right? So like, I don't know, the precession of Mercury, right? That's evidence for a theory, right? And so it seems to be this thing that we use for abstracting. Just doing the empirical stuff, right? Now, my claim is that to attempt to shoehorn all forms of justification, that is argument, into the category of evidence, and all forms of objection, that is counter-argument, into the category of counter-evidence, that's a category error, right? Empiricism should not triumph over rationalism. I think they should work together nicely. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples of things that are not counter-evidence, that are often erroneously talked about as though they are. Formal logical fallacies, reproducibility issues, and competing interpretations of evidence, right? Now, critical thinking, as we hopefully all know, is basically about quality in thinking. Quality assurance, quality control, those are terms that are used in industry. But the point is, we're looking for defects in our inferences, right? We want to identify those, and we want to fix them, and get better at thinking because of that, right? So what does count as a counter-argument? Here's a few that I've identified. This is not an exhaustive list. Again, would be happy to help build it with you. So the first is linguistic. Those would be counter-arguments that contest the meaning of an inference. That could be the identification of ambiguities or misrepresentations. That's the semantic and the pragmatic, respectively. You've got the logical counter-arguments, which contest the validity of an inference. There would be counter-examples, identification of formal fallacies, all that sort of thing. Methodological, you'd be looking at issues with experimental design and replication failures. Empirical, you'd be contesting the accuracy, the soundness, that sort of stuff. Soundness if it is already valid. Counter-evidence comes in here as we traditionally understand it, and the identification of statistical malpractices. And then we've got theoretical counter-arguments as well, which contest the explanatory coherence of an inference, counter-interpretations, theoretical inconsistencies, and we love an anomaly, don't we, right? So those are all some examples of the types of counter-arguments we could make. And I just like to use this word objection. I think the word objection is really nice because it goes really well with the word justification, right? And that's the whole thing about epistemology, right? Justification. So that, for me, is how I've sort of tried to simplify the way we think about this stuff. Now, scientism. I'm going to sort of shift gears here because that's all the context, right? We're starting to get into some more sort of social stuff here. So scientism is a very interesting idea. I highly recommend everyone reads this. This is, I think, just the best dissertation ever written. I just stand by that. This is amazing. A really interesting thesis that was written here by Rachel Christie. And she summarized the ideology of scientism with two claims. There's a normative claim and a descriptive claim. The first claim is that the aims of science, discovering truth and avoiding error, are the most important human aims. So that's the normative claim. Nietzsche called this the unconditional will to truth. And the second is that no practice other than science can achieve these aims. And again, Nietzsche had a term for that, which was the hegemony of science. Now, pragmatists like William James, Nietzsche, he's got a star there because he's actually a proto-pragmatist. He's a funny one. You can't really fit him in very nicely. I would consider myself a pragmatist as well. We generally oppose both of these claims for different reasons. And if you read that dissertation there's a whole bunch of really interesting reasoning in there from William James and Friedrich Nietzsche. The point here, though, is really that scientism tends to sideline philosophy. And ironically enough, that includes the philosophy of science. It's a bit funny, right? And so I think that's pretty much why we've got this theory crisis in psychology. Now, scientism and pragmatism. I know we love a duality, right, in analytic philosophy anyway. So William James and Friedrich Nietzsche, they both explicitly oppose scientism. Here they are in all their glory. Nietzsche heavily emphasized what he called the will to power, and he had this whole philosophy built on that idea. It's hard to summarize, but I'm going to just say roughly it's the idea that science often tries unsuccessfully to overrule the socio-biological context in which it takes place. In other words, scientists are animals too, right? What comes out of this is the idea that truth is not unconditionally valuable, but rather that it's prudentially valuable. It's about practical applications, right? William James said something very similar. He said, truth makes no other kind of claim and imposes no other kind of ought than health and wealth do. All these claims are conditional. the concrete benefits of what we mean by calling the pursuit a duty. Shifting gears again, because I need to talk quickly about rationality. There's quite a few conceptions of rationality in the literature. I went to a talk yesterday by Sam, I don't remember his surname, he talked about all the different meanings of function in biology, and I think it's quite similar, all the different meanings of rationality that there are. There's instrumental rationality, which is behaving in a way to achieve your personal goals. There's bounded rationality, that's about behavior that's adaptive within our constraints, cognitively and so forth. Evolutionary rationality, that's about serving the purpose of the genes. Logical rationality, that's an old school kind of, shut up and calculate kind of rationality, like playing a game of chess, what's the most rational move? And ecological rationality as well, that's a fairly new one from Gerd Gigerenzer, I think, came up with that idea. Behavior that's adapted to the environment in which an organism is operating. And this came out of Herbert Simon's work. Herbert Simon was the one who coined the term bounded rationality. Rationality, it's both practical and it's teleological in that it's goal-directed. So the important part here is that we can talk about rational thinking. We can also talk about rational decisions. It's kind of here or there, right? The assumption is that thinking leads to decisions. So evolutionary rationality considers the interests of the gene. You could talk about the gene's eye view. We could also define it from some other perspective in terms of the multi-level selection thing, the levels of selection, Wilson and Wilson's paper there is there if anyone doesn't know what that is. Or, rationality can also consider different sorts of goals, right? So really, I think to talk meaningfully of rationality, or at least unambiguously, you kind of need to define the perspective and the goal, right? So I think instrumental rationality just becomes the default when people use the word rationality. Now, for my purposes, there's really two kinds of rationality, right? And that's because I'm employing methodological individualism. I want to speak directly to people's personal motivations, right? I'm not interested in what is optimal for societies, for genes, and I will talk about that more later. There's two working definitions of rationality left then, and that is inaccurate thinking, so truth-contrary failures of what you might call veridicality. Hard word, annoying word. But that's the logical rationality paradigm. It's the perspective of scientism. But then there's also counterproductive thinking. We just talked about instrumental rationality. These are goal-contrary failures of functionality. It's also the ecological rationality paradigm. I see those two as quite compatible, instrumental and ecological. It's also the perspective of the pragmatic thinkers. And by the way, we can't really speak meaningfully of one pragmatic movement. There's lots of different thinkers within that movement. But that's, I would say, the rough gist of pragmatism. Now, my view is that when we're describing humans, irrationality is best understood in the latter way. And I'll give a few reasons for that. It engages directly with people's existing motivations. It kind of doesn't matter if they care for the truth or not. And that's a real advantage in what we might call a post-truth world. Of course, that's debatable whether we're actually in a post-truth world, but I'll just take the view that we are. It's also immune to the pragmatist critiques of scientism, right? Because human motivations are valued over these abstract ideas like truth and so forth, right? And my favourite part of this whole thing is that it enables us to bring a health and safety perspective to the whole matter, right? A risk perspective. And that's because people don't tend to aim to hurt themselves. So that's quite handy, actually. Now, rationality in the other sense, the truth failures, that's fine too. It still has its place. It's not a problem. Now, the claim I'm going to make is that consumerism is irrational. And this is, shifting gears again into some really social stuff here. There's two kinds of individualism. So methodological individualism is somewhat controversial. I got hammered pretty hard when I wrote my honours thesis actually for methodological individualism. But I would divide it really into two sort of types, right? Has anyone seen or heard of this, The Century of the Self? Yeah, really recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's very, very illuminating. But the first type of individualism is the one that's discussed heavily in this documentary, which is post-Freudian consumerism. Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, is often described as the father of marketing. He was actually Freud's nephew on both sides, which is kind of funny. But he's kind of the guy who really kicked this all off, at least in that doco. That's kind of how it's presented. And the key idea with this consumerism individualism, consumerist individualism, is unexamined desires and what Freud called the pleasure principle. And that's the source of the controversy, because if we conflate individualism with this, I'm totally on board. I'm not a fan, right? But there's also Nietzsche's perspective, which I'm just going to call like prudence, but it needs a better term. And that's the idea that desires need to be examined. Freud called this the reality principle. Both of these ideologies can meaningfully be described as selfish, right? But the former really only naively so. And that's because consumerism, and this is kind of the whole point of this documentary, consumerism is ironically just a kind of conformism, right? Because ultimately it just ends up with lots of people doing what the marketers tell them to do, right? It's also irrational in that it's self-destructive, and I'm going to get into that. 2 reasons. The first reason is counterproductive goals, right? So thinking in systems is a really good primer for systems thinking if anyone's wanting to learn about systems thinking. I really like this quote though. The 20th century paleontologist G.H.R. von Königswald used to pay Javanese locals for each fragment of hominid skull that they produced, and later discovered that the people had been breaking up whole skulls into smaller pieces to maximize their payments, right? Another good example here of a counterproductive goal. The Aswan High Dam, built at enormous expense to improve the lot of the Egyptian peasant, has caused the Nile to deposit its fertilizing sediment in Lake Nasser, where it's unavailable. Egyptian fields must now be artificially fertilized. Gigantic fertilizer plants have to be built to meet the new need. Plants require enormous amounts of electricity, and they have to run the dam at full capacity just to run the plants. I've since discovered that that's probably actually over-exaggerated. That book was written a long time ago. But there's some other hilarious things about the Aswan High Dam that I can tell you later if you want to know. But the point is that the real world is complex, right? Really complex. And it demands the careful application of systems thinking to really make sure that when you make an intervention, you're going to have the intended outcome. It's really trivially easy to self-undermine by choosing the wrong goal. The second reason that consumerism is irrational, this is my argument, is what I call counterproductive desires. Declan's talk on false pleasure really touched on this heavily. The idea is that people often want things that they don't yet know that they don't really want, right? That's the basis of the principle of informed consent, right? If you give people more information, what they want can change. And that's a really uncomfortable point for consumerism. Pragmatists have been aware of this for a long time. Dewey, for example, he discussed what he called the desired and desirable distinction and stressed the importance of doubting our desires. And marketers, of course, are also very aware of this. They regularly exploit people's unexamined desires. The thing is, though, that this principle applies right back at them, right? Would soliciting objections to your chosen occupation, which some people would describe as gun for hire, make you feel ashamed and or want to quit your job, right? Lots of people avoid these kinds of questions because they're emotionally tough, but I would argue that's counterproductive. So self-examination is prudential, right? I found this meme the other day and I just think it's hilarious. So the unexamined life is not worth living, Padme says, but if I examine my life, it'll definitely be worth living, right? It'll be worth living, right? That made me laugh really hard. Now, I would say, don't worry, Padme, right? It's deeply in our own interest to interrogate our own interests. And there can be enormous opportunity costs associated with traversing dead ends. And furthermore, pursuing the wrong desire, or plan can also have an enormous cleanup cost, right? Social cleanup included, rebuilding trust, that kind of thing, right? And naive desire satisfaction, which consumerism is all based around, is therefore irrational. It's neither efficacious nor is it self-aware. So I would say we need a more pragmatic kind of prudence, right? So there's 2 parts to that. The first is efficacy, and you need systems thinking there. You need to model the environment accurately to know what you're actually doing. And the second is self-awareness. You need to thoroughly examine your own motivations, right? Actively solicit objections to them. There is another element to this which I think is very important, but it's not the topic of today, and that is self-acceptance, coming to terms with what we find, right? Now, on to the ethics of belief. William Kingdon Clifford, he's had a few mentions at this conference so far. I'm going to mention him again. Here he is in all his glory, British mathematician. He wrote The Ethics of Belief in 1877. In this book, a ship owner, well, it's not actually a book, it's a little polemic. A ship owner suspects that his ship needs repairs, but he pushes the inconvenient suspicion aside and then he sets sail. Clifford himself survived a trip like this and was really angry. Now, in Anglo-American criminal law, the ship owner is culpable when an actual shipwreck occurs, so you sort of reactively police these incidents, right? Clifford's view was that the ship owner should be culpable regardless of any actual injury or death. The creation of the needless risk is the problem. And the real crime for Clifford is the cavalier method by which such an important belief is formed and held. It's a preventative approach, it's not a reactive approach because it addresses the cause and not the symptom. It also means that epistemology, in Clifford's view, would become a bit of a sort of criminal matter, at least in some contexts. Now, Clifford's principles are often sort of written down in two parts. The first is that it's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. The second is that it's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to ignore evidence that's relevant to their beliefs or to dismiss relevant evidence in a facile way. That's, of course, strict evidentialism in epistemology, because Clifford also really liked evidence. Now, Clifford's polemic provoked William James to get quite annoyed, and they had a big argument, which is called the Ethics of Belief debate, and you can read The Will to Believe if you're interested in that. James thought that Clifford's view precluded self-fulfilling prophecies that improved problem-solving success rates, and I think James is right about that. Strategic overconfidence would be a good example. But I do think Clifford was onto something, and not a lot of people do, but I think he was really onto something, right? It's a very profound point. They do need reworking, so that's what I'm going to do today. Now, Clifford's legacy is kind of interesting. Why was he not taken more seriously? Why isn't he more famous? Not many people know about him. Why doesn't everybody know the story of Clifford and the ship? Oh, I guess some people know the story of Clifford and the ship. But seriously, I'll offer two suggestions here. One of them's obvious, one of them's not. I think the first reason is that our society tends to be quite reactive, right? We don't really value preventative or proactive approaches to problem solving. I know a lot of people who work in healthcare. They find this very frustrating. The second thing is the evidence thing, right? The evidence-based paradigm, right? It's hard to follow Clifford's prescription consistently when it's put in terms of evidence, right? And that's why this category error matters, right? This is not simply a problem of evidence handling, right? It's a wider problem of objection handling. So we're going to revisit the 20th century debate around the ethics of belief, and I'm going to define a term that I think captures the behaviour that Clifford was really annoyed by, and that's reckless assent. All right, so what is reckless assent? I've noticed that people regularly and sincerely believe, assert, and act upon propositions for which strong objections exist. Counterexamples and so forth, like we talked earlier. I'm going to call this reckless assent. There are a couple more conditions to it, but we'll give those now. I find it really baffling. I've defined what I call the Sarad conditions. So the first is sincerity. That is, it's not ironic, it's not deceptive. They really do believe this. The second is ability. So the subject has the time and the capacity to search for and identify objections if they want to do so. Third is risk. This is really important. The belief carries the potential for grave consequences either for the subject or for others. And that's if it's wrong, especially. The fourth condition is assent, which is that the belief is actually a conviction. It's held strongly enough that the subject trusts it as a basis for decisions and actions. And the fifth condition is kind of interesting, which is dogma, which is if you give the person the objection manually, they really, really don't want it. They squirm, they try and get away from it, right? If you drop that last condition, you get a weaker charge, which is negligent assent. Now, all of this is framed actually in the language of risk, right? It's kind of conceptualizing thinking as an OH&S issue, which I think is actually the right move. So what that would mean is all the standard stuff like risk matrices and hierarchies of controls, all that sort of stuff would apply, right? I think there's some advantages to this. The first is that it helps society to regulate antisocial and destructive behaviour by extending existing legal concepts. The second is that it helps motivate self-regulation because it informs people of the damage that they can do to themselves and to others if they don't think critically before they act. And the third, I think this one's probably the most important of them, is that it helps to align self-interest and social interest by forcing people to confront the self-destructive elements of antisocial behaviour. So here the imperative for critical thinking is health and safety, and that would include, importantly, mental health and psychosocial safety. All right, we're going to move on to wishful thinking. What is wishful thinking? Well, that's wishful thinking. It was also the topic of my presentation last year. Wishful thinking is the folk psychology term for desirability bias, sometimes called desirability effects. It's the idea that there's a causal influence of preferences on expectations about the future. We literally believe whatever we want to some degree. And it's a very strange phenomenon, right? Because everyone should know that our desires can't magically change reality and that pretending they do carries real risks, right? But it's very common. And so I'm asking here in my PhD work, why? So here's the first thing. I think wishful thinking is a kind of consumerism. So we can go shopping for some nice beliefs that might, look a bit shiny. It presupposes that our desires are sort of sacred, that we should really just try and get what we want, if we possibly can. We should rationalise and justify our way through life with the goal of gaining and maintaining those beliefs that seem even superficially desirable to us. And beliefs here are sort of consumed, right, as commodities. They're used for emotion regulation. They're not so much used for practical and functional purposes. And I think it's hard for a consumerist society to perceive wishful thinking as a genuine problem. I'm going to argue that it is. And that's because it's reckless. It's implicated in all kinds of social and environmental issues, public opinion, you can see that pretty clearly. Here's a recent example from New Zealand, of course. New Zealand's car dependence and the strategic issues there with the strait being closed. So wishful thinking is the engine of reckless assent. That's how they're connected, right? So if you look at the dogma condition in reckless assent, there's a desire there, which is to avoid the accountability, right? So even for harmless beliefs, the risk here is that wishful thinking then becomes habitual. I know this is a controversial claim, we can talk about it later. But I think we can speak meaningfully of a wishful to reckless thinking pipeline. Now, of course, wishful thinking is also implicated in the post-truth phenomenon. So what might explain wishful thinking to shine light upon post-truth, reckless assent, and maybe even the Kruger-Dunning effect? All right, a few theories exist already. I've sort of identified 5. I know there are more. The first is adaptive self-deception theory, cognitive dissonance theory, of course, motivated reasoning theory, of course, psychological immune theory, and cultural cognition thesis. These are all pretty cool and worth knowing about. I've got a paper which I'm desperately trying to publish. There's a really funny story there, but essentially I don't think self-deception makes the cut, but I haven't, and also I haven't spent time examining the last one because I sort of ran out of time there. But I think the others are all pretty much, they all provide pieces of the puzzle, right? They need integrating and extending. So that's why I've made my own, and I call it doubt aversion theory. And because wishful thinking is sort of a pretty childish thing, I'm going to illustrate it with baby photos. So, doubt aversion, what is it? The idea here is that wishful thinkers accurately perceive that attaining and maintaining their valued beliefs will confer genuine benefits to them. I think a lot of philosophers don't want to grant this, but I think it's true. I think there's genuine benefits. So here we are with the wishful thoughts, happy, happy, happy. So community membership would be one, self-esteem, satisfaction, peace of mind, anxiety reduction, and maybe even a sense of competence. But the problems start where we start underperceiving the potential costs right from the start because we're not going looking for unknown unknowns. And then we've got behaviorism kicking in, right? Wishful thinking becomes associated with a reward. doubting becomes associated with a loss of reward. And so I think we can actually call doubt here an extrinsic punishment. So to maintain the benefits of their beliefs over time, wishful thinkers then start to strategically avoid doubt-inducing stimuli, just like that. And sunk costs make the distorted perception of the benefit-cost ratio of wishful thinking worse over time. And the way that that works is that it increases the perceived cost of the uncertainty. So wishful thinking then necessarily produces an aversive attitude towards doubt, or self-doubt to be more accurate, which I call doubt aversion. Then we get into the metacognition. Now, doubt aversion is going to prevent future learning about anything challenging, just like that, including the costs themselves of wishful thinking. So by this point, the overperception of wishful thinking's benefits versus costs is basically locked in, and all of this is going to start producing serious risks for the wishful thinker and, of course, for those around them. They can reduce, of course, their exposure to these by developing conditional metacognitive knowledge about self-doubt, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment. So this might be the first condition with low conditional metacognitive knowledge, and then high conditional metacognitive knowledge, being wrong becomes appealing. But doubt aversion can, again, obstruct this process. So in summary, wishful and reckless thinking is explained. I take that to mean produced in this context because I like a mechanistic sort of explanation by the metacognitive neglect of doubt aversion. So the idea is very simple. Teach conditional metacognitive knowledge about self-doubt and Bob's your uncle. No more wishful thinking. That's the idea, right? Need some empirical results as well to really examine this. Now, in practice, what does this mean? Here's some objections to self-doubt that are widely held. Doubting oneself in general is not fun. Doubt is paralyzing. It leads to inaction and missed opportunities. Doubt is weaponized by our enemies who want us to lose faith in our leaders. Confidence is strength. Doubt is weakness. Doubt might create conflict. Doubt is disrespectful to tradition, undermines authority and stability. Doubt might leave me without a foundation on which to base my worldview, Descartes. And I've spent time in therapy for doubting myself too much. These are just a few of the things I've heard people say. And sometimes you've really got to go looking because people don't tend to want to tell you this directly. But all of these objections, I think, are based in misperceptions, right? And as educators, we need to rigorously prosecute these conversations and really investigate this stuff with people. Sort of co-design ways out of these objections. So per Plutarch and Socrates, this is sort of the educational task, right? The lighting of the fire of self-examination. Just like that. Happy Padme. All right. Thank you, everybody. Now, I do have, I have an FAQ, I have a summary and a few other things, but for those who need the references, I'll just put it up really quickly as well. And then I guess we could get into the Q&A. I'll move on to the summary. All right, I saw your hand first.
Thanks, Ted. That was great paper. Sorry, I said that. Now I'm having a bit of self-doubt because I said that it sort of sounded dismissive. That it was a great paper. So, but I think there's maybe some conflations in the way you're using self-doubt.
Yes, there is.
So,
yep.
Because if you take the going to my therapist case,
yep.
That's a sort of like I'm doubting myself, I'm kind of lacking confidence.
Yep.
Which could be epistemic.
Yep.
Confidence in my belief, but generally it's like.
Yeah, I like that point, and it's kind of good because that conflation itself could be part of the reason that a student, for example, doesn't want to doubt, is that they actually don't realise that's a different kind. You know, that's completely different. And that, in fact, might be, because I said down here they're based in misperceptions. That could be, in fact, the misperception is we might need to point out to someone, hey, that's actually different. Yep. Were you next?
Yeah.
Maybe was, oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, up the front, sorry. David? That's fine.
I want to ask about individual variation in doubt aversion, because the picture you've given here is sort of almost like it's universally the same stakes for everyone.
Yeah.
There's presumably quite a high degree of individual variation.
Yeah, there would be, absolutely. In fact, a very high degree. And I mean, why do some people go on and study philosophy? Why do some people not? I think that's going to be a big part of the reason, is just individual variation. And that's fine. What I'm really interested in here is studying, because wishful thinking, again, exists on a spectrum, but I'm really interested in studying the sort of etiology of the process itself. Do you think that the individual variation would undermine my account, or do you think it could be incorporated?
I think there's a push to expand the account.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. An expansion. Yeah. Even better. Yeah. Let's do that. Was it Joe?
Yeah. Great talk. I really enjoyed it. There was a lot, which is not a complaint, but there was a lot of like moving parts.
There was. Yeah.
And I'm just trying to still sort of a little bit get my head around it. A few terms I didn't know precisely how they're being used. So this is more just trying to get a sense of it, but also I think I am coming from an alternative perspective.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So what I was thinking when you showed the diagram and you were saying, how could this be improved? If I'm remembering correctly.
The one on evidence?
Pardon?
The one on evidence?
The one on evidence in the beginning.
Yep.
I'll
go back to that so that we can talk about it. That's the great thing about it.
And then it had like a subtitle saying uninterpreted something.
Yeah, the great thing about diagrams is how easy it is to refer to them, isn't it? Yeah, there we go. That's the one you're talking about, right?
Yeah, okay, so unprocessed information, getting to phenomena,
which
is patterns.
Yeah, patterns.
And I was just thinking, where does evidence come into this?
Great question. Yeah, do you want to keep...
I was just going to say what I was stipulating.
Yep, go on. Yep.
So to me, evidence is sort of like interpreted data.
Yep.
Data is not evidence. And
yep.
The reason why I was thinking that was important in one of your first steps is that I did think you were giving people sort of an unfair shake by saying there's this idea they're ignoring evidence in the post-truth world because there's so much.
Yeah.
And I feel much more that their problem is they're having to interpret a huge amount of information. And so they go for very wide, flat, shallow interpretations so that it can accommodate all that information.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm totally with you. So I knew I was going to get this question about, okay, what's going on here? Yeah, there's often a distinction drawn between data and information, where information carries some kind of meaning, right? And so the interpretive act goes on there. And that's all that I'm trying to really show here. But perhaps this picture of philosophy of science needs modifying even to incorporate that difference between data and information. The funny thing about humans is that we so naturally do pattern recognition that it's kind of hard for a lot of people to separate these first two. And so it's a bit of you really like coming at it from a computational perspective. It starts becoming a bit clearer that like one data point does not a phenomenon make, right? But yeah, we can talk more about this later if you're interested. Yep. And also I agree very much on it's not about ignoring evidence. It's about matters of interpretation. I'm happy to accept that. I want to make sure I get. Oh, okay, lovely. Was it Calvin? Yep.
Yeah, I would just looked up the Combank ad campaign. Doubt never did, right? Which is a huge campaign.
Oh, these marketers! I need the marketer up. Where is he? There he is.
So this seems to suggest not just that people avoid self-doubt, but that there's an actual effort to.
Yeah, totally.
So what do you think about this? I mean, what's the background of that?
I think that's a fundamentally important issue. I was going to say at the start, I think with the Kruger-Dunning stuff, I think what's going on is the interplay of personal and social factors. So I think people at individual levels sort of have their perspectives on this, and then they go and project that onto others, and that would be one of the ways in which that takes place. So I think it's fundamentally important. In fact, if you go soliciting objections to self-doubt, one of the most fertile places to find it is like religious, like church web pages and things like that. They've got huge lists because that obviously want to disincentivize doubting in order for their followers to sort of go along with the thing. So yeah, I think that's fundamentally important. Who was next? Sorry, I'm going to need a hand with moderation here. Was it James?
I'll go. So when I see this fanatics, obsessions, ambassadors, religions, maybe I'm being uncharitable, but I'm sure it's happening on the far right as on progressive, non-progressive politics and ideology, but I find the doubt is seen, as far as I understand, doubt is usually pushed back with people who are more, I don't know, cognitively very endowed. Doubt is pushed back because it's seen as a possible moral failing.
Yep.
And that creates, and it's interesting that it brands into religion, because that's how religion works as well. Doubt in religion is often seen as a moral failing.
Yep.
So I just wonder what your...
So everything that you've just said there would fit very nicely in that list of objections. So what it would be is doubt is a moral failing. And then as educators, we need to realise if someone holds that view, and we need to engage with them about that view and sort of pull apart the assumptions on which it depends and investigate that with them. Yeah, that would be how I would talk about that. Gaia?
Thank you for the talk. That was very interesting. I just wanted to propose a possible further objection that I was thinking about, which is the insufficiency of self-awareness and self-doubt. Because I think a very plausible case might be that someone achieves sufficient kind of self-awareness, and it's like they have all the extent resources to understand where they're going wrong.
Yep.
But still decide not to take the right decisions because the emotional and cognitive cost will be too high.
Yes. Yes. So, yeah, you're getting onto something that's in the FAQ, actually. I will put that up. That's really important. Here we go. Ooh, sorry. Just went a little too far there. I'll just scroll straight to it. So, here it is. Sorry. That one. Right, so I've got this point here, like surely this doesn't fall entirely on the individual. Was this the one? Sorry, remind me of your question, because
Yeah, the insufficiency of self-doubt.
the insufficiency of self-doubt. Someone could have all the
epistemic resources to understand where they're going wrong, but still decide not to pursue the right options because it's too costly.
Oh, that's right, yes. So, yeah, there can be very legitimate reasons, and I'll talk about social pressures there. There can be very legitimate disincentives that are real-world disincentives that I don't think I'm ever going to judge someone for deciding not to doubt under those conditions, right? But, of course, all the stuff I've talked about with reckless assent would be intended to apply in conditions where there is ability, as I said, that second. So if you don't have the ability, then none of this stuff, I'm not going to hold people to that standard if they don't. If they're at gunpoint or something, you know, I'm not going to hold them to that standard. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, partially. I think it's more that, like, even when they do have the ability and they have all the affordances in their environment to do that, still the cost might be too much.
Yeah, that cost would be the
inability.
that would meet the inability condition. Yep.
Okay.
Up the front here. Yep.
Thank you for your presentation. I thought that was really interesting. This is kind of a small point, but I think it might make your story a little bit stronger.
Yep.
You talked about sunk cost fallacy strengthening this, but it was framed almost as like one of the steps in the story.
Yep.
I wonder if sunk cost fallacy is actually needed here, and I think it's right that it would strengthen this story.
Yep. Yep.
But you might not need to appeal to it, right? Because that's another kind of cognitive bias, and then you could say, we still fall into this trap of doubt aversion,
Yep.
even if we're not experiencing so much.
So where that sunk cost thing comes in, I said I took different puzzle pieces and put them together. One of those puzzle pieces was cognitive dissonance theory, and in cognitive dissonance theory, you have this thing called the dissonance ratio, and in the denominator of the dissonance ratio is what is it? It's the ratio. There's a ratio between consonant and dissonant beliefs or something like that. But the point is that the sunk cost basically plays the exact same role as it does in dissonance theory. So that's sort of why that's in there. Does that sort of make sense?
What I mean is that the rest of your story might still function to produce what you want to say.
It doesn't need that as well. I do think it's very important practically, though, in terms of watching how people's lives unfold and watching how this stuff plays out. Because, again, it's different to the conditioning. It's sort of a separate thing, but both of them over time result in someone who's quite unwilling to doubt. Yeah. Anyone else? There were a few other questions.
Sort of another
Yep.
one, but if there's some, I'm wondering how you go, so if anybody else.
Declan?
Okay, just a quick one. The consumerism stuff I really like. I really enjoy that. I wonder if another avenue is kind of looking at the critical theorists like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, and they talk about this reification of beliefs and consumerism. It's a very wide area, so you might not want to get into it, but I think there are some kind of social critiques that could come into it. My only question was on the SARAD.
Yeah, the SARAD
I
conditions.
just wanted to know a bit of clarification, like if you had like kind of a paradigmatic like case study that, just so I could kind of.
Yeah, so the Assange case actually is what got me into this. So watching the way that the public, very well educated people by the way, were interacting with the information that was available to them to form their belief about whether Assange was a hero or deserved to rot in hell forever, right? Now, I happen to know that there was lots of information available that I could go looking for. And I happen to also know that if I got my opinion wrong on this case, that was potentially very, very significant in terms of risks, right? So I really needed to investigate it, right? But I noticed that a lot of people just didn't perceive the risks, maybe. That's charitable. That's being charitable. But the point is also there were very good resources available. So in particular, Nils Meltzer's, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture at the time, he went and investigated the whole thing, and just his entire position on it changed because he investigated it. And I mean, all you had to do was listen to his lawyers. People didn't want to give Julian Assange himself the time of day. They didn't give him right of reply, which of course was not helped because he was in prison, right? And so I just thought it was the most fascinating case study of people like violating these conditions who are otherwise extraordinarily well educated, and you know, I trust them on most of their other sort of epistemic judgments, right? And I was like, what is going on here? You know, and I think the risk condition is really key in that. I think a lot of people, I mean, I really enjoyed last night hearing from the police officer who we had talking about critical thinking, the importance of, you know, when you have the time to think, do the thinking, you know, and then, yeah, there's going to be times where you don't have a lot of, you know, time to think and so forth, but you need to have sort of done that just in order to stave off some of these risks, you know. So the case study I think to use is the Assange case, and particularly that book by Nils Meltzer, which I highly recommend. I can give that to you later if you're interested.
Okay, so.
Oh, yeah, sure, happy to do one more.
So there's another kind of phenomenon, which is almost the opposite. So I wanted to.
Yeah.
So it's where rather than reckless assent, there's a kind of reckless or abundance of doubt, like a unnecessary. So the way that people weaponize scientific methodology, so they'll go, no one's proven that, you know, climate change denies, no one's proven that, and so on, right? Or that would do,
sorry.
for example, because we don't have much time. So I wondered if there's some sort of, it's going to be in the FAQs, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's
I just wondered whether
it's this this one.
Theories as well, right?
Yep.
Or that's partly the action because it's weaponizing. You know,
Yeah, it's that one. Yeah.
But I just wondered if there's some kind of, is there a sweet spot between the two?
Yeah, I did sort of think this because I think it kind of gets a bit meta at that point. But I think there are, like, if you spent all your life examining everything in incredible detail, you'd probably be in this room. But also, like, there are some costs there. Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be trade-offs at some point. But the thing is, I think you take a risk perspective on that, right? You say, what are the risks? And we sort of go from there. So I think we can just plug in the way that the OH&S industry already operates directly into that. Yeah.
Have you thought about that risk matrix with respect to critical thinking pedagogy? Because it seems to me that sweet spot's what you're trying to aim at.
Yep.
Pedagogy, right? So.
I guess for this work, my point is simply that most people err way too much on, when I say most people, I do mean approximately 95% of people, and I have reasons for saying that, which you can inquire about later, err way too much on the side of not doubting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.